Why is there more Star Wars games in the 90s than there is today? It's quite a hard and ambiguous question to answer. But before we answer it, what exactly happened for Star Wars gaming in the 90s? Well, it was during the 5th generation of consoles, led by the mascots the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation 1. And thanks to both of these consoles, it ended up being quite the golden era for Star Wars gaming, with 10 unique Star Wars games releasing over the course of 5 years on both consoles respectively, 4 for the N64 and 6 for the PS1. These range from 3D platformers, flight simulators, arcade racing, 2.5D one-on-one fighting, and even arcade-style rail shooters. But if we fast forward to 2021, we're just about entering the 9th generation of consoles, and unfortunately, it's quite a somber, gloomy time for Star Wars games, with only 6 official AAA Star Wars games released in the past decade. LEGO Star Wars 3 The Clone Wars in 2011, Star Wars Battlefront in 2015, Star Wars Battlefront 2 in 2017, Jedi Fallen Order in 2019, and the recent Star Wars Squadrons in 2020. We could involve smaller titles like the Oculus Quest's VR story Vader Immortal, or the mobile phone cash grab that is Galaxies of Heroes, but they either don't reach the expected game time of console games or simply aren't a reasonable game at all. So with this arguably long intro out of the way, it begs the question, why is there so many Star Wars games being developed during the mid-90s compared to today? Many will jump to the argument that games take longer to develop and more expensive to make than they were 15 years ago. But were they? Well, let's find out. Our story takes us a bit further back in time, well before the 90s. The original Star Wars trilogy had just finished its peak in popularity on the big screen, and its complete free film collection was beginning to appear on store shelves. George Lucas, in the midst of his success, decided to take a minor detour in his content creation. His next venture, video games, and they weren't going to have anything to do with Star Wars. Enter LucasArts. Established in 1982 by George himself, the company immediately cooperated with Atari and began publishing original concepts and IP. Popular games like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Labyrinth, and The Secret of Monkey Island were just to name a few. But it wouldn't be until 1991 that we saw the first ever Star Wars game come from George's video game company. Conveniently named Star Wars, LucasArts would then release a new Star Wars game yearly. This trend would last about a decade. This yearly trend bled into the 5th generation of consoles too, with a new original Star Wars game every year on either the PS1 or the N64, starting with Star Wars Rebel Assault 2 The Hidden Empire, which came out in late 1995 for the PS1, an unusual arcade rail shooter which utilized the power of CD data storage, weaving in cutscenes of live action footage of actors in the original outfits and props used in the original trilogy. Technology which consoles like the Atari Jaguar, N64 and some Sega Saturn products couldn't utilize because of their cartridge-based media. Not much is known on the development of the game, besides the fact that it sold very well, yet panned by critics for its low difficulty, poor performance by actors, and anticlimactic final level. Next came Star Wars Dark Forces in 1995, a Doom clone that introduced many new features such as the ability to look up, down, duck, swim and jump. Production began in late 1993 and finished only a year and a half later in the summer of 1995. The game was then ported to the PS1 a year later. In 1996 came Star Wars Shadow of the Empire, Primarily a third-person shooter, the game went an extra mile to simulate various vehicle combat sequences and a flight simulator system, which also led to the development of Rogue Squadron on the same platform. The project started in late 1994, and it too also had around 1.5 to 2 years of development. In late 1997 came Star Wars Masters of Teräs Käsi, a 3D fighting game set on a 2.5D style plane. Being the first ever fighting game to come out of LucasArts, it was painfully obvious. Despite help from the magicians of VFX that are ILM, the sluggish movements of characters, unbalanced movesets, and lightsabers generally being stronger than anything else in the game, it was met with a reasonable amount of criticism. Starting development on Christmas 1995, it was announced at E3 1996, and shortly released after 1.5 years of development for Christmas 1997. But after 3 years of ambiguous Star Wars titles, that was about to change. Enter Star Wars Rogue Squadron for the N64. Launched in December of 1998, an arcade-style flight simulator with vastly impressive graphics stunned Star Wars fans. Factor 5 co-developed the game and proved to be worth their expertise to LucasArts. Nintendo had a system called microcode that allowed code to be directly injected to the console's reality code processor GPU, allowing developers to get far greater performance from the system. The drawbacks? It was extremely difficult to code in, and its documentation on how to use it was poor and entirely in Japanese. Nintendo kept this system for themselves during the console's early lifespan, giving them an edge over Western developers. After lengthy board discussions between Factor 5 and Nintendo, they gave them unique access to the microcode. And it really shows. Incredible graphics, full voice acting, brilliant soundtrack, and fantastic gameplay. The game was in development for roughly 2 years, which was quite short for a game of this caliber, but succeeded in reaching its Christmas 1998 launch. The remaining games came in every year after that. Star Wars Episode 1 for the PS1 in 1999, and Star Wars Episode 1 Racer for the N64 in the same year, followed by Star Wars Episode 1 Jedi Power Battles and Star Wars Demolition in 2000 for the PS1. Finally, Star Wars Episode 1 Battle for Naboo came the same year for the N64. However, all these games had far shorter development times because of the release of the prequel trilogy in cinemas in late 1999. Some were panned by critics, others loved. But what every single game in this era shows is how long they were in production for. Most games were in development for roughly 2 years, showing us a pattern of how fast games in the 90s were reaching gold status from conception to final. Well, the obvious answer comes back to games of today take longer now than they did in the 90s. But if we look at when games began development and when they were released, we start to see a pattern in LucasArts' business approach, being that the company always had at least 2 games in development and never relied on a single release. Whilst there were co-developers on some of these projects, they all led up to one singular developer and publisher, LucasArts. But why does any of this matter? Well, now it's time to go forward in time a little as we follow the path of yearly Star Wars games up until 2012, otherwise known as ...2012, the year Disney purchased the Star Wars franchise for $4.05 billion. And in no more than 6 months after the deal was made public, LucasArts in all their glory was shut down. In return, a 10-year contract with EA to handle all of Disney's video game ventures for Star Wars in both development and publishing. Some in-development games suffered an unfortunate death because of this. The infamous Star Wars 1313 became a cult favourite for fans after it was announced the game was to be axed. And as a result, the company became a small team that handled licensing partnerships for toys, venues, and other miscellaneous dealings. From here, this is where games slowed down to a crawl. If we disregard the mobile games, pinball machines, web browsing gaming adverts, it would take 3 years for our next official Star Wars game, Star Wars Battlefront. There was, however, supposed to be 2 games released by LucasArts before then, Star Wars 1313 in 2013 and Star Wars Attack Squadrons in 2014. As for Battlefront, it was relatively well received, mostly praised for its incredible graphics, only possible thanks to EA's in-house engine, Frostbite. 2016 brought LEGO Star Wars The Force Awakens with lukewarm results from the media as the game focused on just one movie rather than a whole trilogy. 2017 brought us back to Battlefront 2 by EA, using the same engine with some graphical enhancements, new game modes, characters and much lengthier online service support to its predecessor. However, it was plagued with pay-to-win mechanics commonly seen in mobile games, and also contributed to the loot box scandal of the same year. But it would be another 2 years until we see the next Star Wars game, Jedi Fallen Order. A huge success, of course, following the success of a similar single-player game, God of War, the year prior. It became a favourite among most Star Wars fans. As EA's 10-year contract begins to enter its final years, they release a smaller AA game based on the flight simulation game mode from Battlefront 2. Although reusing some assets, the game went into a completely different direction, making it one of the most advanced Star Wars flight simulation games in both graphical design and detail, as well as gameplay and esports competitiveness. After that, the path grows cold. The next LEGO Star Wars game delayed for almost 2 years, and the Jedi Fallen Order sequel isn't expected for release until 2023, a stark difference to what we had seen a decade prior. But why? Is it truly because games take longer and more money to develop? Well, it certainly looks that way, as price per MB for players decreased from $10 in 1980 all the way down to $0.001 in 2020. It has never been more expensive than now to hire a developer, and the risk has been astronomically low for buyers in return. But that hasn't stopped other companies. Nintendo, Ubisoft, and Xbox gaming studios have been reliably pumping out games of a brand far more frequently to great success. Not to mention, game development has been more accessible now to the indie and budding hardcore fan. So why hasn't Star Wars followed the same path? The answer: Disney. Many like to point the finger at EA, but the reality is, with the company generating $1 billion in revenue on a mobile game that only took a third of development cost compared to Jedi Fallen Order, mixed with the difficulties in communication with Disney over each Star Wars game, it adds more possibilities of failure for a high-risk game under the brand. Whereas LucasArts had direct connection and communication with the creative team behind the films, TV shows, books, and more. EA takes on a greater risk by having to work with a new company that never wanted involvement in video game genres in the first place, which makes a little more sense as to why EA CEO Andrew Wilson never wanted the 10-year deal in the first place. Not everything is bad news, however. With the announcement of Lucasfilm Games at the beginning of 2021 and the end to EA's licensing contract, many are speculating that we could see the return of frequent Star Wars games in development, whether they're good or they're bad. Whilst the next Star Wars game in 2023 seems quite far away right now, the possibility of getting yearly Star Wars games thereafter doesn't sound so bad at all, for now. In conclusion, developing games for current generation consoles is more challenging than consoles of ages past. Yet, developing games, even complex ones, are just more accessible to the everyday man than they ever were during the 90s. And the rationalization that games are more expensive to make never stopped EA, despite them taking the brunt of the hatred from fans. But with complication after complication between shifting Star Wars games into its new official canon storyline, rumours of a new CEO never wanting the 10-year deal in the first place, and overwhelming profit from low-cost mobile games were the prime rationale for less Star Wars games in general, and never because of the time or the money. Whilst Disney is mostly to blame for the incredible drought in Star Wars gaming in the past decade, EA certainly has had a hand in it. Well, that pretty much wraps up today's video. Of course, I'm always interested in your thoughts and opinions, and will be keeping a sharp eye in the comments. Besides that, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.